Hello, everyone. This is Peter, and you are watching the Command Valley podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deck techs like this. Today, I am talking about Brudiclad, Telchor Engineer. Brudiclad is a legendary artifact creature artificer. He costs 4, a blue, and a red, and he is a 4/4. He reads, creature tokens you control have haste. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 2/1 blue mirror artifact creature token. Then you may choose a token you control. If you do, each other token you control becomes a copy of that token. The inspiration for me building this deck came from me looking at the Saheeli the Gifted Precon deck and also looking at the Duretti Scrap Savant deck, combining them together under the helm of Brudiclad. As a result, a lot of the cards in this deck are not super optimized to work with Brudiclad, thus this deck tech has 2 parts. The first being, what does my deck look like right now? I'll go over the structure of my deck, the different categories that I've drawn up for it, and what I aim to do to win. The second part is, what do I want my deck to look like? In this, I'm going to be looking at some alternatives to the cards that I already have in the aim to build a better deck that synergizes more with its commander. First off, let's talk about artifacts. We've got a whopping 37 artifacts in this deck, including yours truly, Brudiclad, and we need some cards that will support these awesome artifacts in this deck. Ethereum Sculptor and Chief of the Foundry are great here because they help our artifacts come into play more easily and make them more valuable on the field. Additionally, we have Padim, Console of Innovation, which gives our artifacts hexproof and gives us a bonus for having expensive artifacts. While these cards protect the artifacts that we have on the field, we also have cards that get our artifacts back from the grave. Duretti Scrap Savant has a ton of value in being able to recur artifacts from your graveyard multiple times, as well as getting some great card value off of his +2 ability. Felden of the Third Path, also from the Duretti Precon, will help us get artifacts back in the form of tokens, which is very useful to Brudiclad, but more on that later. For our final bit of recursion, we have Goblin Welder and Goblin Engineer, which will both be able to help us get those valuable artifacts back from the graveyard. Let's get into the biggest part of the deck, our token generators. Because of Brudiclad's ability to make tokens, give them haste, and make copies of other tokens, we want lots and lots of tokens to be able to turn them into other things and hopefully deal massive amounts of damage to our opponents. This comes in 2 forms, cards that make tokens and cards that copy. There are a lot of token generators, so I'll just highlight a couple of my favorites. Saheeli the Gifted is a legendary planeswalker for 2, a blue, and a red. She comes in with 4 loyalty. She has 2 +1 abilities, the first one being create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. And the second one being the next spell that you cast this turn costs 1 less for each artifact you control as you cast it. Her last ability, her ultimate, costs 7 loyalty, and it reads, for each artifact you control, create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens gain haste, exile those tokens at the beginning of your next end step. Saheeli has a lot on her, but she kind of fits all of the categories we want to see in this deck. She creates tokens that can be turned by Brudiclad, she makes spell casting much easier, and her ultimate makes a ton of tokens that can hopefully win us the game when she gets around to activating that. All around, it's an outstanding inclusion in this deck. Then we have Retrofitter Foundry, which is an artifact for 1. The first ability says, pay 3, untap Retrofitter Foundry. Next, pay 2 and tap it to create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. The next one is pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice a servo and create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And then you can tap it to sacrifice a Thopter and create a 4/4 colorless construct artifact creature token. This has a lot of value in this deck, especially to get this making servos for you to build up an army early before Brudiclad comes out. On top of this, having a way to make a 4/4 construct army at basically any point in the game is a huge bonus, especially when other things are making Thopters. Having this out, tapping it, making a 4/4 creature, and then making them all 4/4 creatures with Brudiclad, it's crazy good. Speaking of Thopters, we have Thopter Assembly, which is an artifact creature Thopter for 6, and it's a 5/5. It has flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control no other Thopters other than Thopter Assembly, return it to your hand and create 5/1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. This is helpful in a pinch when you need to make a lot of tokens, and they probably won't be staying as Thopters for long, so recasting Thopter Assembly makes a lot of valuable tokens to be copied. Then we have Reef Worm, the worm that just keeps on giving. With this on the field, when it dies, your token army just got a whole lot stronger with a bunch of 3/3s that come back stronger every time you die. And each of those comes back stronger every time they die. And it just gets bigger and bigger, and it's really hard to handle the wave that Reef Worm brings. And finally, for our token generators, we have Mirrodin Besieged, which is an enchantment for 2 and a blue. As it enters the battlefield, you choose Mirren or Phyrexian. If you choose Mirren, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. And if you choose Phyrexian, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card and then discard a card. Then, if you have 15 or more artifact cards in your graveyard, target opponent loses the game. Both sides of the enchantment work in our favor, just depending on what stage of the game we're in. If we're low on tokens, the Mirren half will help us bridge that gap. If we're late in the game and we've got a lot of artifacts in our graveyard, the Phyrexian half will help us take out those tricky opponents. Also, if we need some card advantage, Phyrexian is great for cycling through those cards. This is super great in a deck that has more than 1/3 of its cards being artifacts. Now, let's talk about our copy spells. The deck naturally has a lot of them because the most valuable way to use Brudiclad is to make a copy of a valuable creature and then make lots and lots of copies of that creature. So let's take 3 cards that will really help in accomplishing that. First, we have Prototype Portal. Prototype Portal is an artifact for 4. It has imprint. When Prototype Portal enters the battlefield, you may exile an artifact from your hand. And then you can pay the artifact card's converted mana cost to create a token that's a copy of that card. This card will really help us get a valuable creature or artifact onto the battlefield over and over again. This can help us in a variety of ways, such as getting more mana rocks or getting that Thopter assembly out multiple times. The best part about this card is that you don't have to do it on your turn, so you can bring that valuable card onto the battlefield with mana you've held up from a previous player's turn that you could also use for some interaction. It's just amazing value on this card. Next, we have Mirrorworks, which is an artifact for 5. Whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that artifact. This can just be the card that we need to get that huge artifact creature out and make it into a token, and then Brudiclad takes care of the rest. Lastly, we have Mimic Vat, which is an artifact for 3. It has imprint. Whenever a non-token creature dies, not just your own non-token creatures, I might add, you may exile that card. If you do, return each other card exiled with Mimic Vat to its owner's graveyard. And then you can pay 3 and tap it to create a token that's a copy of that card exiled with Mimic Vat. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Mimic Vat allows us to not only get value off of our own creatures dying, but also value off of our opponent's creatures dying. You have no idea how good it feels to Mimic Vat your opponent's Grave Titan and then swinging 10 Grave Titans right at their face. It's an incredible card. So those are the highlights of my deck, but I've got a ton of interaction pieces, mana rocks, and other useful cards that will help make this deck a fun deck to play every time you bring it to the table. However, I find a lot of cards in this deck are either repeating effects from other cards or not giving me the value that I need to give this deck the tools it needs to make it great. Here are the things that I'm looking at to improve my deck's performance. The first thing is interaction pieces. I've got some good spells that can help mitigate my opponents, but I've got 0 counter spells, which kind of feels bad when half of the colors that you're playing are blue. So let's change that. I'm looking at cards like Confirmed Suspicions, which lets us counter a spell and create 3 clue tokens to use however we wish on our turn. We could use those for card value, or maybe we just want to turn them into something else. Maybe some other classic spells such as Counterflux and Swansong to add to our collection. Adding those 3 cards alone should allow us the additional protection to our key pieces that we need. Next, we are aiming to make lots and lots of tokens with this deck. I have some token generators that make maybe 2 tokens max in this game, so we can do a lot better than that. I'm talking about cards like Clone Legion, which will create a token for all of our creatures, and in turn, Brudiclad will turn them all into a single strongest creature to help us win the game. It's a lot like Saheeli. It's just another one of those spells that gets us a ton of tokens. Next, we have Chasm Skulker, which is a creature squid horror for 2 and a blue. It's a 1/1. Whenever you draw a card, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when it dies, you make 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk onto the battlefield, equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it. Not only can this creature get very big very fast, but no matter how big it gets, having a creature token with Island Walk could help us win the game very quickly, especially when your playgroup is playing a lot of blue. One more card I'm intrigued to try is Tillinolly's Summoner. Tillinolly's Summoner is a creature human shaman. It's a 1/1 for 1 and a red. It has Ascend, and whenever it attacks, you may pay X and a red. If you do, create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. At the beginning of the next end step, exile those tokens unless you have the City's Blessing. It's definitely not hard to get the City's Blessing in this game, especially with all of the tokens that we're going to be creating, and she only has to attack once before we have a giant army of tokens, and she only costs 2. It's a great card, and I can't wait to play it. Last but not least, probably my favorite card that I keep on kicking myself for not having in this deck is Rite of Replication. Rite of Replication is a sorcery for 2 and 2 blue. It has a kicker of 5 colorless, and you can put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of target creature. If Rite of Replication was kicked, put 5 of those tokens onto the battlefield instead. This, of course, is an awesome way to make a ton of tokens, but even if you don't have the mana to make 5 tokens of one creature, with Brudiclad, all we need is 1 token to make a huge impact on the game. There are so many cards on my list that I'm interested in adding. Brass's Bounty will help us create a lot of tokens, and I can even use them for mana or make them into more creatures. Cards like Quasi-Duplicate, Helm of the Host, Flame Shadow Conjuring, and Supplant Form are all valuable copy spells vital to the strengthening of our tokens. And lastly, cards such as Combat Celebrant, which allow us to have infinite combat phases, and thus infinite tokens if you can make a token of it. And that's it. Thank you for watching my deck tech on Brudiclad. This is truly one of my favorite decks to play. This deck has the ability to very quickly build up a board of ultra powerful creatures, and I want to keep on improving my deck to be one of my best. After all, that's the spirit of Commander, to always be improving your deck and to have fun with your playgroup while doing it. If you enjoyed watching this episode of the Command Valley podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe for more Commander content. We're releasing a deck tech every Monday, so we hope to see you here next week. Let us know in the comments what decks you would like to see in the future for these deck techs. We're always looking for suggestions, and we want to be making the content that you want to see. Be sure to check out our other deck techs as well, produced by our talented team of deck builders. I've included a link to the deck list in the description of this video. Thank you all, and see you next time.